Are you wondering how to get super creamy bokeh or that blurred out background in your photos? Or how to shoot in low lighting? If you answered yes, then you need to learn about aperture because that's one of the main settings that can help you achieve that type of look in your photos or your videos. Hello friends and welcome back to the studio. This is Susie with Gemini Connect and this is the second video in a mini-series in which I'm going to teach you how to get your camera off of auto and how to shoot in manual or semi-manual modes. So in this video, we're going to talk about the camera setting known as aperture. Here's a review of the chapters in case you want to skip ahead to any of the timestamps. So first of all, what is aperture? The best way to explain aperture is to relate it to how your eye works. So if you look at your eyeball, the iris is the colored part of your eye and the pupil is the dark center. When you go from a bright environment to a dark environment, the iris in your eye expands or shrinks, changing the size of your pupil. This helps you see in bright and dark conditions. So aperture is like the pupil of your camera. It's the opening in a lens where the light passes through and enters into the camera. I can show you physically what that looks like. So if you look into the center of my lens here, I am currently at f1.8, but I'm going to change that aperture up to f22. And you notice how the little hole in the middle of the lens is changing, and that essentially is your aperture. So where do you find your aperture? First of all, it's important to understand that aperture is also known as f-stop. So in a lot of cases, it's displayed as f/or a number, and that number is your aperture. So one place where you can find aperture is on your lens. It's so important that most lenses will actually have the f-stop written on them. In this case, our aperture or f-stop is 1.8. If you power your camera on and look at your camera settings on the LCD display, it'll also say f and a number, and that also is your aperture. And finally, if you take a photo that's already been taken and you look at the EXIF data, you can also find the aperture or f-stop. So how do you set aperture in your camera? The first thing you'll have to do is change the mode on your camera. So take it off of auto or program mode and switch it over to aperture priority mode or to manual mode. If you're just starting out, I recommend shooting in aperture priority mode first. It's a lot easier because you can set your aperture or your f-stop number and the camera calculates your shutter speed for you. When I have enough lighting, I actually shoot in aperture priority mode the most, as opposed to full manual, which gives you full control to set your aperture and your shutter speed, and that can be a lot more complicated. So how you change your aperture or f-stop on your camera really depends on what brand you're using. For Fujifilm, this is one of my favorite ways to change the f-stop, but that is done through the lens. This is not a Fujifilm lens, but it's a lens by 7 Artisans, and it's made for Fujifilm cameras, so it operates in very much the same way. But right here, this front barrel has the f-stops noted on there. So you would switch this barrel around to change your f-stop. But on pretty much every other mirrorless camera or DSLR, such as by Sony or Canon or Nikon, you're gonna use the dials on your camera to change your aperture or f-stop. Now in some cameras, such as smartphones or action cameras like GoPro, they have apertures or f-stops, but that's a setting that you're not able to take control over. So that's one of the reasons why you might want to get a camera that is different from those, just so that you can have more creative control over your aperture. Next, how does aperture size affect your f-stop? This is probably the most confusing concept to wrap your head around, but basically a smaller f-stop number, such as f2.8, is equivalent to a larger aperture or more light hitting your sensor. Compare that to a high f-stop number such as f11, that is considered a small aperture or less light hitting your sensor. So in the upcoming sections, when I'm talking about having a larger aperture, that actually means having a smaller f-stop, as opposed to a smaller aperture, which means having a higher f-stop number. I hope that's not too confusing, but hopefully these visuals can help you visualize and better understand what I'm talking about. So how does aperture affect your resulting photo or video? Well, there's two ways in particular. Number one, it affects your overall brightness. As your aperture changes size, the amount of light hitting your camera sensor changes. A large or a wide aperture passes a lot of light through, which results in a brighter image. as opposed to a smaller or more narrow aperture, which results in a darker image. So what this means in practical application is that if you're shooting in low light, then you should be choosing a larger aperture or a smaller f-stop number. Next, aperture affects your depth of field. Depth of field is the zone of sharpness that's in front of and behind a subject where the lens is focused. Very simply put, it's how blurry or sharp the area around your subject is. If you have a shallow depth of field, then the background is completely out of focus. If you have a large or deep depth of field, then both your background and foreground are sharp. And by the way, all of that out of focus background is known as bokeh or bokeh. Now today, quite a few modern smartphones can replicate this shallow depth of field effect. It's known, I think, as portrait mode on iPhones or live focus on the Samsung Galaxy Android phones. And other basic cameras such as GoPro cannot give you a shallow depth of field at all. But on cameras where you can control the aperture and you're after that shallow depth of field, then you want to choose a large aperture or a small f-stop number. This is really effective for portraits or just creative imagery. But it's also important to note that it's not just the f-stop that affects your shallow depth of field. It's also the relation between the camera and the subject and the background. So if you have a small f-stop number and you're still not getting that creamy background, then try playing around with the focal length. You might need to zoom in a little bit or even walk physically closer to your subject or place your subject further away from the background. Now, most people really like that blurry background effect, but it's not always applicable. Think about real estate photography, architecture photography, or landscape. In that case, you want more of your image that's going to be in focus. And in that case, you want to choose a small aperture or a large f-stop. Next, let's talk about aperture and how it relates to your lens choice. This also explains why certain lenses cost a lot more than others. So the main restriction to the aperture that you choose on your camera, it depends on what kind of lens you're using. Every single lens comes with a maximum aperture and a minimum aperture. So lenses with a maximum aperture of, say, f1.4 or f1.8 are deemed as fast lenses because they're able to shoot better in low lighting and also give you more and usually more pleasing bokeh or that blurry background in your shots. The only catch is that these lenses tend to be a lot more expensive than zoom lenses or those with a slower aperture. So examples of slow lenses are those with a maximum aperture of, say, f4 or f6.3. You can still sometimes shoot really good bokeh with these lenses or shoot in low lighting, but it's a lot more challenging. Another type of lens to know about are these variable aperture lenses, such as this Sony 24-240 lens. It has a variable aperture of f3.5 to 6.3. And this basically means that at different focal lengths, our aperture is changing. So if I'm shooting at 24 millimeters, I can shoot at f3.5. But if I zoom all the way out to 240, then the fastest aperture I can shoot at is f6.3, which is pretty slow. Compare this variable aperture lens to this 70-200 fixed aperture lens. This one has a fixed aperture of f2.8, which means that if I'm shooting at 70 millimeters, I can shoot at f2.8, and if I zoom into 200, I can maintain that f2.8 aperture. So this is a lot better for shooting in low lighting as opposed to this variable aperture lens. The main difference besides the size is the price. Variable aperture lenses tend to be a lot cheaper. This one I think is like $950 as opposed to this fixed aperture lens, which is $1,350. There are a lot of other factors that go into lens pricing, but the aperture, whether it's fixed or variable, is a pretty big factor. Well, that's all I have to say about aperture for now. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions, and stay tuned for the upcoming videos. In the next one, we'll talk about shutter speed, what that is, what settings to use, and how that relates to aperture. And following that, we'll have the final video, which talks about ISO and how that relates back to aperture and to shutter speed. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.